and that is a question about such personal work that has this other mission, something very, very deep and personal. So you are still, though, a performer in this. This is not psychotherapy. This is not a history lesson. This is, well, how do you describe it? This is a poetic display.
You see, this journey, these questions, maybe, first of all, they're there to help me clarify my own journey.
Mm-hmm.
How did I get here? What is a possible next step?
Mm.
Over 20 years ago, when I started, showing my work in the US, now I remember once I was in Seattle. No, it was in Minneapolis at the Walker Art Center, and Philip Beitler had organized an encounter with the local African-American art community. And I remember there was this young woman, I can't remember her name, but who was like, oh, it's so good to meet someone who comes from the motherland and who knows, their culture. And I was like, I'm going to disappoint you because we are just as broken.
Mm.
One thing that we have on the continent is that we were not taken away from the land, unlike our enslaved brothers and sisters. But even though we remained on the land, everything was made to cut us from the land and to cut us from who we are. And so it takes a lot of work to really get to that point where you can just say, my name is, and know exactly what it actually means.
Mm.
And that's why at some point I started talking of my dance as an attempt to remember my name.
Mm.
Because then it's about going to this space where you try to clarify that moment for yourself. But because I'm a performer, the question is, when I take that on a stage, whom am I talking to?
Very good question, yes.
And so...
And who are you talking to when you take it on stage?
It's not one that destination. It keeps shifting.
Mm-hmm.
But for the sake of simplification, let's say, and that's also what I use when I teach, when I ask my students, whom are you talking to? Let's say, let's reduce all possibilities to 4. What does it mean to be there and to just remember my name to myself? So I'm talking to myself. But if I'm talking to myself, what is the status of the audience?
That was one of the questions that when I made my questions yesterday, I woke up in the middle of the night and said, I didn't ask him this question. What is the audience's relationship to your experiment, your journey, your process? What you have any thoughts about that?
So I'll go back to that just in a bit, because the second possible destination, it's like our answer to the question, whom am I talking to, could be that I'm talking to my partners. So when I'm on stage and I bring, whether it's small or large, a community together around an idea, maybe the whole project is about being in conversation with one or a group of people that I'm collaborating with. Mm-hmm. So we are trying to clarify something between us. Again, the same question, if you're talking to yourself or to your friends with whom you're making this journey, what is the audience's position? Because you're not doing this in your own bedroom or in a living room, you're putting it on a stage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Third possible destination, it's like maybe actually I'm just talking directly to the audience. What does it mean to ask those questions in the Congo, where we pretend not to know that how broken we are.
Oh, is that true?
Oh yeah, and that's why we are very loud. And I always say we fear the silence because it reveals a lot about the void in us. And so we loud, we party, and some people are like, oh, there's a frivolous people. I'm like, no, there's something more profound than that. And the Cameroonian thinker Achille Mbembe.
Yes, I'm a great fan of his writing. Yes.
So over 10 years ago, Achille wrote a piece which was first published in a magazine that is published from Cape Town on arts, culture, and politics on the on Africa and the African diasporas. It's called Chimurenga. And there was this article, it was called Variations on the Beautiful in the Congolese World of Sounds. And he was talking about the idea of beautiful in the Congolese pop music scene. And how it has become like a space of resistance, but also a space of mourning, and yet it's a party. It's permanently a party.
Permanently a party. Well, this is wonderful because I was feeling a bit amiss in that I had not directed the questions to the things that you have offered. For instance, as I look at the work of people from around the world, particularly people who are Black bodies like mine, I try not to make assumptions about what your experience as a contemporary artist is. Are you thinking there's terms, post-colonialism, racism? I'd say, don't ask those questions of him. Let's talk to him as if he is he has the same privilege that any white artist would have, that he is a neutral and a poet.
Oh,
and let him talk about his work in the way he wants to. Now, you have taken us immediately into what I would say is, in some ways, not knowing how to know your name is a political idea.
Oh, yes.
So then the whole notion of the poetry of what you do becomes more urgent. But let's go. I thought I was trying to be very scientific. The body, right?
Yeah.
And you are. Is it fair to say Kaboku and you are the same?
Yeah.
So I was referring to him as another entity. So
yeah. That's why, the alter ego.
I'm sorry?
Kabako is my alter ego. That's
so
my other me.
I see. The storyteller, Kaboko, after years of reflection, travel, and making works, confesses an obsession with the quote, ruins of his country. He declares, I only wanted to dance, but where could I start? Tell us something of your dance history. What and or who has inspired you?
So I'm obsessed with history. And sometimes I say that obsession was born on that day of May 1997. I was 23, living in Kenya. Because by then I'd left my country. It's been 4 years since I'd left my country in search of greener pastures. And with the $300 that I had from my mother's small business, I looked at the map of the continent. I was like, from Eastern Zaire, as my country was known then, I was like, with this money, I can reach this country, and this country. What is the most stable? It's Kenya, and I went there. And that's where, up until then, I was doing theater. And it's in Kenya that in 1995, 2 years after I'd gotten there, I took my first dance classes, and I was like, oh, I think this is what I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in Kenya in 97, so 4 years after I'd arrived there, when I woke up one morning, I have this ritual of listening to the radio, and I heard on radio that my country had stopped being Zaire. All my life, I'd known that space as Zaire, and I needed to call myself Congolese.
Mm.
It was very disturbing because, it's like, what does this mean? And so when you start digging into history, because up until then, I was taking being Zairean for granted. It's like, yeah, I'm Zairean, that's it. I have a passport, that's it.
Right.
And suddenly, it's like, no, it's not a given. What does it mean? And then
who gave your country the name of Zaire?
Mobutu, who was president from 65 to 97, so for 32 years. So
why did he give this name?
So in 1971, so he had been in power for 6 years when he decided to change the country's name. And he coined a term which was called the going back to authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
So Zaire was meant to be our authentic name.
Mm-hmm.
And as a child, you go to school that is drummed into your head from age 5. It's like, you're a Zairean. You're a Zairean.
So it is a fact that Zaire, a fact. In other words, the people of your community would have recognized this idea of his as being itself authentic.
No. And that's what is interesting, because you realize that Mobutu's plan was this performance of authenticity.
Mm.
And the whole ethos was, how do I do things different from the colonial that were here? And he went really far. Like, the Belgians had left us with the European tradition of first name, family name. So you have, and in French you say prénom et nom. He said, we'll be different. We will have le nom, the name, and the post name. And so he banned all foreign names. So growing up, I was not officially Faustin. No one was officially John or Vincent or Marie. No.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You had a first name, which was actually the family name. And then you had a post name that it was literally called post-nom. And your post-nom was your special name. So the name identified you with a bigger group, a family, a clan. And then you had your own name. So on my papers, until 1991, I was Linyekula Ngoi. Faustin did not exist. But I grew up in a Catholic family, so when you are baptized, you are given a name. And so Faustin existed on my baptism card, but not on any official documents. That was one aspect of Mobutu's authenticity. The other, only that, to just stay with the name, that was not true, because the family name tradition was a Belgian invention. It's European. My people did not have family name traditions. Everyone had their own specific name, which said something about circumstances of their birth, But then there would be other informations added to the name, where it's like Linyekula, son of so and so from that village, and because people's geography then was fairly limited, people were known.
Mm-hmm.
And so had Mobutu gone fully all the way to the end of the authenticity regime, he should have banned the family name traditions.
Uh-huh.
And in my family, until the 30s, no one was called Linyekula. The first Linyekula ever was my grandfather. That was his special name. But then in the 30s, when he started the family, the Belgians said, all your children will be called Linyekula. So
I'm sorry, the Belgian, what did the Belgians say?
They said that all his children from then on would be called Linyekula. So I became Linyekula. It became
but before that, before the 30s, if you were speaking in a traditional society, and people would want to know, well, where do you come from? Your name would tell them where you came from, wouldn't it?
You'd say the name, but you'd always add from Yaokoki clan, Yalikutu village, Yalihila, from Isangi. So the territory grows larger and larger with every name. Mm-hmm. And that's why introductions were long. I am so-and-so, son of so-and-so, grandson of so-and-so, from this clan, from this village, and names, introductions were a whole ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
We still have a bit of that in West Africa today. In some parts of West Africa, when people introduce themselves, it's the whole lineage that comes forward. It's like this thing that I once heard, like secondary sources. I heard Oprah quote Maya Angelou saying, like, I came as one, but I stand as 10,000.
One more time, please, because yes.
I came as one, but I stand as 10,000.
Ah.
And for me, I understand it, in that way. It's like, if I'm here, if I remember my name, and because every name open and web of relationships, I will remember all this web. Who is my father? Who is my mother? Where do they come from? Who are their ancestors? And because no relationship is static, it's always dynamic, even saying my name every day shifts me.
When did you reclaim, if that is a term, Faustin? When did you reclaim that?
So in 1991, because Mobutu stayed in power for 32 years, thanks to the Cold War. Because he was the man of the West in Central Africa, the heart of Africa. And so he was viewed as the shield against communism.
Mm-hmm.
And they protected him fully until the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, when suddenly he outlived his role, his historic role. Mm-hmm. And so his friends in New York, in Washington and Paris, started putting a lot of pressure on him to democratize the regime. That's the term they used. And with the democratization process, many of those rules that he had set from 1971 were reversed.
Uh-huh.
And so it became possible to use your Christian name as it was referred to then. And because it might sound contradictory, it's like, well, why would you claim a European name?
Mm-hmm.
But the oppressive regime we've grown up under has made it that actually using your European name is a way of reclaiming a space of, of freedom and liberty.
This is very complicated, isn't it? Oh, so
very complicated.
Yes. Well, but okay, but just quickly, just anything you'd like to tell us about your dance training? Why do you move the way you do?
So I came to dancing through the back door of theater.
Mm-hmm.
And I just had, I call it like this incredible chance of meeting when I was 15 in Zaire, in my city, in northeastern Zaire, which is called Kisangani. There was no professional theater company, but you had amateurs in the beautiful sense of the word, literally people who loved theater and who loved sharing their love of theater with the younger generation. And these people, when I went to their workshops, they taught me something that stayed with me to date, which is that theater is not about character or text or costumes. It's about a body in front of other bodies and how you negotiate that relationship. It didn't make much sense for me as a 14, 15-year-olds going into this space with, grown-ups. But many years later, I was like, oh, I think this is really the foundation.
Right.
And the way they approached theater, it was all about the body. It was about storytelling. Because you see, also one thing about traditional forms of performance in our communities, which is that it's always a total spectacle. And the model is the storyteller. The storyteller can become a character, can drop the character and just be outside. The storyteller is a songster. They can break into a dance and, nudge the entire, gathering into a dance. Then they go back and they continue the song. They continue the story. And the way they would end is always of taking you back to your responsibility. Because
what your responsibility? What do you mean?
Because when they say the moral of the story is, it is a moment when you, as the audience, you have no choice but to position yourself vis-a-vis what you've just gone through. So, if the moral of the story is this, where do I stand? And so it's a very empowering space. It's not just a space where you are spoon-fed and you are on the receiving end. You have to be active. So this was really the kind of tradition I grew up with. And now doing French plays like, by Molière or Marivaux, but with this background, it created, and I didn't realize it when we were doing it, but later on I was like, okay, so these people who are school teachers, or some students, journalists, they were really inventing a theater where Western literary traditions were brought into the fold of our ancestral storytelling traditions, and they were inventing something with that. And at the heart of it all, it was always the body. And I think that's what really made it possible for me when I went to Kenya in 1993. And in 1995, there was this first workshop, a contemporary dance workshop, and I was invited into it for it, like many other people, because then in Kenya, there was no contemporary dance. I could find my way into this space because I was like, oh, there is a certain understanding of a performing body that I'd developed that helps me get into the dance space, even though for many years I could never dare say of myself that I'm a dancer. Because I believe in rites of passage, and the dancer's training is a very rigorous series of rites of passage.
But now and this was back to the question: are you a contemporary maker of dance performance? Does that, in my experience, that meant, what is the lineage that you come from? Have you studied ballet? Have you studied Horton technique? Have you studied? That's what it meant to be the rite of passage you talk about.
Exactly.
You have to have done this work, and people even did it every day to maintain a certain sharpness in that style. So did you have a practice that was rooted in something like modern dance or ballet, or was there a practice? Did you do traditional dance of the Congo when you were in your training?
So I started from those traditional ancestral dances because that's what was available. But because I started those dances at a moment when I could be more analytical about movement, about what it means to be, on stage. I was not just looking at dances as a series of steps. I got drawn to the principles that could be behind. And one important principle about our traditional dances is this notion of accepting gravity. You bend your knees, you sink into the ground.
Right, yes.
You may jump, but you begin by accepting gravity, and you build from that space. And the moment I understood that, I felt that it freed me on many levels, because then I could look at a ballet dancer, a Western ballet dancer, and say, oh, actually, this is just one other answer to the question, how do we deal with gravity? So the Western ballet dancer developed an answer of defiance.
Yes, but now what about a concept which was very prevalent in Western dance? It's all been exploded now, but the idea of architecture of the body and line, making design in space. Is that part of this analysis that you indulged in?
I came across Bill Forsyth's work, because like when I came across the CD-ROM, because not so many, years ago we still had CD-ROMs, and he had called it improvisation technologies. A tool for the analytical, was it the analytical body or dance? Anyway, and the way he was breaking down the whole process, where it's like, well, it begins with imagining lines. So it's point. So you have a line between those 2 points, and then this line can be outside the body, but if you leave it here, maybe you can shift it and it becomes inside the body. I can transfer it to another limb. And so I started playing with it, but only to a certain extent, because again, coming from this strong tradition, and where to say, oh.
Now the tradition that we're speaking of what is the tradition, the strong tradition? What are you speaking of?
Because when I started looking at what was available around me, it was like the traditional dances from the Congo. I was like, well, what is the nature of lines in this dance? And you realize that, there are very few straight lines. It's about curves, circles, and spirals. How do I reconcile Bill Forsyth's point line and this idea of curves, circles, and spirals?
Mm-hmm.
And so constantly in this space of dialogue between what I am discovering about myself and about the heritage, and but also what because all this, it was never through direct interaction with these artists. I was on the continent. I didn't have access to all these, these artists. So you'd read about them and about some of the things that they're saying about dance. You would, like in the case of William Forsythe, there was the CD-ROM, but that's all. So you have to interpret it in the light of what you have access to, which are the traditional dances from home.
Right.
And
well, one thing that I was led to be proud of in being an African diasporic person was, we'd always say in the traditional African society, there is a direct transmission of watching student and teacher, that dancing was about learning by doing. The implication was it was not a theoretical idea of dance making. It was a tradition that served purposes of the community, coming of age, war, all of those things. So were you also proud of that idea that you did not have Mr. Chikedi or Waganaba talking about lines, what the correct line is to make? But in Africa, there was no such tradition of theory, if you will.
Somehow, yeah, definitely, because I think that, okay, first of all, when you grow up on the continent, your entire education, even today, 60 plus years after most, independence in the majority of countries on the African continent, all our education is still about how to become Europeans.
Ah, yes, of course. Mm-hmm.
And so it takes a lot of effort to even begin to see value in what comes from us and from our ancestors.
I see. Uh-huh. Hmm. So this is this too much to say that this is part of the ruin of your country that you were observing?
Oh, yes. That's the most important ruins, actually, because the physical ruins are easy to rebuild. But the ruins inside us, that's a different story.
Oh, that's really huge. Let's move on a little bit. I said here that I must confess to relying on my poorly informed anthropologist lens in looking at your articulate, deeply personal way of movement. And your publicity material says that Faustin imagines his own artistic journey in terms of his personal circle and asserts that his archives, the archives of the body, cannot be experienced alone. And there are certainly many, quote, invisible others, collaborators on the stage with you. Most tangibly is the wonderful musician playing trumpet. He is also moving. Could you talk about your relationship with him in the work? Are you both one entity? Are you both real or poetic projections? Now, it's a little bit too rich. Do you want me to break it down? Oh, please.
It's very clear, You see, this work is really the continuation of a work that was born in New York at the Metropolitan Museum in 2017. Because, as you know, they invite sometimes performers, to propose things in their galleries. And when I was invited there that year, I asked if I could see all the pieces from the Congo that they had in their collections. And amongst the 100 plus pieces that they have, in the Met, there was this wooden statue with a tag that's read Lengola people. And the Lengola, that is my mother's clan. That's my mother's ethnic group. So it was like, well, this is a piece of my history, my ancestors' history, that has been sitting in the Met storage since 1986. And so I took pictures of that and traveled to the village where my maternal ancestors are from. And I went on that journey with my mother, who had not been there for 42 years. Because
What's your mother's name?
Yenga Osako.
Yenga Osako.
So I went there with my mother, and going there, I discovered a lot of stories about family history. And suddenly I knew names that I'd never heard of. And we'd go 8 generations back. But then it was striking that I'm in my mother's clan, but all the names that I'm hearing are only men's names.
Yes.
And so I was like, well, I need to meet the women in the clan. And because history does not remember them, I'll ask the most talented sculptor in the village here to imagine the 8 generations of women in my clan. And I say 8 because we could retrace 8 generations of men. And it was like, okay. So it was like a very simple, dramaturgical propositions. Like,
this is the sculptor Gebaga.
Exactly.
Now, what did he think of such a request? What did he think? Did he think in terms of gendering his sculptures? And yes, what did he think of it? What was that conversation like?
So Baga, and like most traditional sculptors who are still active in that region, they're used to such requests because most of those sculptures are made for ceremonies and where you need like a proxy to have the presence of your ancestors. And so it was within what he knows. The only difference is that he had to imagine who these women may have been. Unlike when someone goes and say, okay, you remember my father, he died and all that, I want to do something special around. And so he was not working from a concrete human being that existed or people could tell stories of. Here he was literally working from a space of invention. It's like, okay, there were these 8 generations of men, so let's imagine a woman per generation. Has the 8, and so for it was like, this would be my first partners in dance. So I'm not dancing alone, I'm dancing with the women, ancestors.
Oh, well, we're going to come back to this, but just for a moment. I'm sorry, the presence of that man on stage with you.
Exactly. So
how does that work into what you're telling me?
So when I talked to Hero, because see, for me, every piece is a way, a form of conversation with a friend or a collaborator, and it was like, no, for this work, which is about trying to make sense of loss, somehow, I think Hero is the right person. It was an intuition first. We were in Senegal together. It was his first time in Senegal on Gorée Island when I talked to him about this. And I'd kind of staged. I was like, yeah, I'm making a new piece. And this is the frame. And I want you to be in it. And we were.
He is also Congolese.
No.
He's not.
He's American.
Ah, he's American. Ah, they thought there was something in the nature of the trumpet that sounded familiar to me.
He's American.
So he's what we call a jazz musician.
Exactly. And he was trained by Marshall, who took over Sun Ra's orchestra after Sun Ra passed. So he's Marshall's student, and he played with Marshall in the Sun Ra orchestra at some point. And we were with him, and suddenly he started talking of the Atlantic, and like, yeah, there are probably some of my ancestors who never made it to the Americas who were here. So I just want to blow my horn. I'll imagine the stage as the Atlantic, and I'll blow my horn and try to talk to them just in the same way you're trying to dance to talk to your ancestors. And so when someone goes to that kind of space, I really try and restrain myself from asking them to explain to me what exactly they're dealing with. Because it's important that we retain our own opacity. Here I'm quoting, Edouard Glissant, where it's like, as the former colonized, or as colonized, because I'm not sure that colonialism is over.
No, I don't think it is.
Yes, as colonized, we are expected to be transparent so that the colonial master can classify us easily. So we don't have the right to opacity. But Glissant, Edouard Glissant, Martinican poet, thinker, when he writes in The Poetic Revelation about reclaiming the right to opacity, because a human being is a mystery. I was like, well, maybe not asking questions on whom are you talking to, Heru, when you're playing, but just allowing you. I have a rough idea. You're dealing with your ancestors, I'm dealing with mine, and yet we're on stage. We have the audience as possible witnesses.
The audience as witness.
Yes, to this moment, hoping that as witnesses, we can open a window for them to make their own journeys individually, hopefully, because it's like you enter into a silence, and because you've gone into this silence, you encourage other people to go there because they recognize a voice from within themselves.
And let's move a little further. I know that when I was looking at the tape is shot so that your beautiful stage and the upstage, the area where your props will be, but then there's a sea of white heads, white people.
Yes.
And I say, well, this is very familiar to me. I wonder how Faustin feels. Now you're saying you would like those people to bear witness to something that is universal in all of us, or are they looking at something that is going to be exotic?
Well, until I started coming to Europe, I always say that I never saw the skin of my, not the color of my skin. Then I started, coming to Europe. I was like, oh, actually, I'm Black.
Yes.
And there are people who seem to know better what it means to be Black. And they're not Black. But they can tell you what it means to be Black.
You mean anthropologists, historians?
Yes. And they've shaped the European understanding of Africans and of Black people to an extent that 22 years ago, there was an article in Libération about my work. And the conclusion was, he's got talent, but he's wasting it by refusing to act African.
Oh my God. Yeah. Oh.
And I was like, yes, then yes, I'm not acting African. I am African, and it's a very complicated space. I don't know what it means. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. So thank you.
Bravo, bravo. Just on this, the floor, the floor, is that mud on the floor?
So I was like, well, do I want to put the proxies for my ancestors on just a black marley? Like, maybe not. But we're in theater. How can I trick them, actually? How can I trick them to think that they are probably on the land of their own ancestors? But I was like, okay, we'll have the color. But I can't travel with tons of earth from that part of the world. It's like, okay, how can I trick the audience? Because I'm tricking my ancestors, in the form of these statues, to take the stage as the land they come from. And that's why, for me, it's important to acknowledge that it's a performance moment, and where we create a convention. I convince myself that when I step on that stage, I'm on this land. My partners, among them these statues, have to believe with me that it's that land. But then the audience also has to believe that it's that earth, even though it's not that earth. And the simplest way that I found to achieve that was to spread coffee.
Coffee, yes.
It's ground coffee. And when you put light on it, it really looks like the earth in my ancestral village.
I think that's one of the things that I had heard, is it possibly from my collaborator, Janet Wong, that there is a component of smell.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Because then you walk into the theater, it's smelling of coffee. And we know that the history of coffee, and of exploitation, but without screaming it, we just put it there. It's, first of all, a visual answer to this question. Okay, how do I bring, something that would remind me of the earth? And we land on the coffee. It's like, oh, this is good for when I'm outside the country. Because when I'm in the country, I don't use coffee.
No, you don't.
No.
What do you do when
we take the ground, the earth.
You bring the dirt into the theater.
Yes.
So, how the title "My Body, My Archive" is provocative. The term, as you know, archive, has become a familiar, even fashionable term. What does it mean for you, the archive?
It is this space that needs to be activated. First of all, it's never a given. And like you have it and no, you need to go back and reactivate it every time for it to make sense. And I was talking about history and my interest in history, the history of my country. What you realize is that if you're interested in history and you come from that part of the world, you're confronted with the question of archives. they are not available. But archives in the form that was imposed upon us. Because my ancestors did not develop a writing system. So their way of archiving their history and their experience of being alive was through masks, through their statues, songs, dances,
Stories.
So but now with colonialism, all that was broken. And a new way of archiving was imposed upon them. They were told that all those traditions were satanic. Their masks were taken away. Their religions were banned. And a new religion was imposed. They had to learn how to read and write the Western way. And so it means that if you're interested in history, for a long time, you're confronted with the question of absence of archives. Or for a long time, you only having access to the winner's archive. And in any case, even the winner's archives don't go far enough. Because as a nation state, my country exists only since 1885. So we're talking of like 100, just 100, not under 200 years. That's nothing. You cannot understand the evolution. Yeah, this is 140 years. You cannot understand the evolution of a people over such a short period of time. That's where it's like maybe being a dancer is an opportunity, because every dancer's body is, or every human's body is ancient. Even
ancient,
a baby.
Ancient, you say? Ancient.
Yeah, ancient. Because even a baby who's born just now has genetic information that says something about their ancestors from many, 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 many generations back. Maybe this is also how I, after like that period of analyzing movement, learning traditional steps and all that, when I started asking myself the question of the archive and how to uncover this experience from my body, I was like, maybe my dance is just about activating this body, hoping that it will begin to speak a language. I'm not even sure that I can understand this and I can understand it, but I'll ask the question anyway. And so maybe
I've heard this said by other artists. Ironically enough, they are oftentimes people of color artists who say that my every performance I give is adding to the archive. Now, is this the archive of the colonials that's in some library or somewhere that now it has CD-ROMs, it has videos and so on, and now I see your work and I put it in that, or is it a parallel archive?
First of all, I'm not adding onto an archive. I'm digging into this archive that is there.
I see.
And in 2005, I heard Professor Wole Soyinka in a conference in Paris. He said something that stayed with, it's very simple, just said, the important thing to remember is that the past is never dead. And so if I say I'm adding onto the archive, it's as if I'm inventing something. No, my quest is to try and access this archive. Will that add something? I don't know, but at most, I hope it helps me clarify.
That's a wonderful answer. Now, Linyekula unearths and shares the histories of women in his family. a tribute to his maternal lineage. As you have certainly observed, our era is beset with questions of gender.
Yes.
Can you focus in on any aspects of my body, my archives, from the point of view of gender, customs, movement? What is female that I'm seeing there?
First of all, for me, it was about meeting through these imaginary ancestors, but meeting my mother, who's still alive. And she's relatively young because she's just 15 years older than me. She was 15 when I was born.
Yes.
And I remember she came to the show. One presented it in the Congo, in a yard.
In a yard, you say? In an open area?
Yeah, open, and the dust coming up. And that. And after everyone left, and she just came, it's just like, thank you for honoring me. It's like, how did you know? It's like, wow. If you talk about my ancestors like this and about the women like this, I feel honored.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not a woman, but I was raised by women. And it's interesting that I was raised by a very Catholic father who led the choir in the church, but I was initiated to traditional religions by my grandmothers. And it was, so the ancestry and the passing on of those traditions was the women's territory.
So your father did not, as a good Catholic, he did not reject this.
Yes.
He allowed this to happen.
But it happened. And so it is, so the female in the work, it's this acknowledgement of how the women in my family, my grandmothers, first of all, helped me ground myself on that land.
Yes, I have a similar experience. I think it is probably almost a joke for people who know my work, particularly in an improvisational way. Bill often goes to church, quote. I'm not a believing person, but I sing the songs from my mother, and they're often religious songs. So it seems that when they say you're going to take us to church, I guess I'm trying to come closer to something authentic and deep and real. And it looks like you can imagine this is a bit of a problem in an era where the Black popular music dominates the world. But I don't think it's a Black popular music that is talking about the Middle Passage, slavery, what have you. It's talking about style and fashion and sex and all of those things. So are the women still in your world the caregivers of the tradition? Are they still that for you in this world?
Less and less, unfortunately, less and less. Because, first of all, those traditions are extremely, extremely fragile right now. You can blame it on the never-ending, crisis in the country. It's war and crisis and war, which just does not allow a lot of those traditions to thrive.
Yes.
Because this is a space where we try to remember that we are humans. And when you don't have peace, when all your energy is expended at just trying to survive, it's very difficult. They're fragile, but they're not dead.
Mm.
So, and because in a country like the Congo today, being a woman is the toughest job ever. Because just living in that country is tough, but living as a woman in that country is even more difficult because the women's bodies have been the battlefield.
Yes. And I have heard an interview with, I guess, freedom fighters, Congolese freedom fighters, and they were asked, why is rape such a prevalent idea? And the answer was a very peculiar, first of all, everyone was in a mask, they were hidden. And they were saying, well, we have to suffer out here, therefore they should have to suffer. This is what these fighters are saying about why women are such targets. It sounds like a hate for women. Am I being too abrupt? What is that attitude?
No, it's not hate for women. It is actually because they understand the power of women in every community, that they know that if you want to break a community, you have to break its women. So if you conquer the women's body, you've conquered that land.
Oh, bravo, that's very powerful. I admit that there were moments in the piece when I could have been watching a documentary of a village in Congo life, or religious ritual, or some other specific event as represented by drums and chanting. Could you share any insights into the presence of this soundscape? Now, you've mentioned Mbembe, but there was times when there was I was watching your very strong contemporary presence, and yet it felt like I was being transported to a place that was other, I dare say exotic. What do you think? What about that when that is happening? Now, there's a beautiful horn cutting through, there's the coffee on the floor, there is your articulate black body, but now I'm hearing what sounds like something I would normally see in a documentary. Is that something you're working with?
Yeah, you see, the documentary aspect of the work that's definitely there. And it's deliberately there because, again, I hope that I don't fall into a space of illusion.
You don't what? You don't fall into what now?
A space of illusion.
Illusion, aha.
Some years ago, I heard Peter Sellers, who's a very dear friend, in a conversation, and we were talking, and it's like, yeah, actually, maybe theater is nothing but poetry in context. And so I'm attempting, hopefully, a poetic gesture, but how do I make sure that the context is not lost?
Mm.
Which means that I traveled to this village, I met these people. They're real, they're concrete. I recorded these drums because on the day I was there, the last day, we improvised the party, which was special because, as I was saying, with all the war and the crisis, people have forgotten sometimes to just take space for these collective parties. So we brought the whole village together and we danced. And it's important. It's important.
How did the village understand? This is not a holiday that they would, or recognized feast day or holiday. This is an artist who is making a work and he wants you all to come down and have a party. Is that what the invitation was? How did they understand what they were participating in?
No, they don't even look at me as the artist who's doing this. They just say, it is our son who's come here, because since that first trip, I've been going there all the time and being part of, as much as possible, of the village life. So if, like when I went there the first time, the local primary school, they did not have enough books, teaching material for teachers. When I went back to the city, we bought and sent it to the village. And so this is the relationship I have. It's like, it's one of our sons who went abroad and who comes here every now and then. And so when he comes back, it's a moment, we breathe, we celebrate. So my art thing, so that's why sometimes I say the most important, maybe it's not art. I know how important it is for me, but when I'm there, the most important is to just create a space where people can breathe and maybe say, oh.
Well, I noticed from reading about your bio that you have been part of other activisms, what is it, clean water, education, all those things, which are not necessarily in the description of what an artist necessarily does, but you are operating in the context of what and who? Are you a social justice warrior? Are you, what are you? How do you understand yourself in that situation?
I mean, Aimé Césaire, Martinican poet, one of the co-founders of the Negritude movement, he coined the term negritude actually in 1939. When he decided to leave Paris and move back to Fort-de-France in Martinique, and where he was a mayor for several decades, there's this interview, three-part documentary series, where he's asked, how do you reconcile being a poet and being a mayor? And he says, okay, see, poetry is about invention. So if I'm on the streets, I'm in a part of Fort-de-France where we did not have a road, and we bring a road there, for me, it's like a poetic gesture. I was like, when I heard that, I was like, oh yes, so these things are separated. It is about being part of a community and inventing a space of possibilities for you and the people around you there. That's
and
all.
It is, in fact, a poetic gesture as much as a social gesture.
Exactly.
Very, very important to hear. I would like not to keep you too much longer. Well, what have you discovered or unearthed about your country's history or history in general with all of these many pieces you have made? Is there anything what have you discovered or unearthed about your country's history or history in general?
The main thing is that it's always written from the winner's perspective. And therefore, my responsibility would be to try and see what is besides the main story. What is there? And to place myself in that space, not because I view myself as a marginal, no, but just a way of trying to uncover something that can connect myself and the people around me just a little bit with themselves. Just that. Just
so this is what history is. Is this about history?
Yes, that's what it has taught me. It's like, because it's always from the winner's perspective, I should try and care about what is not in the main picture.
What is not there. And your job is to fill in the picture.
Exactly.
You mentioned that is also the gesture of a poet.
Yes.
Right. Well, beautiful. You travel a great deal. How are you feeling about the world at this moment?
If I'm analytical and objective about it, it's rather gloomy.
Mm-hmm.
But I also know that in the middle of all this, there are people, activists, artists, and even in politics, but there are people who are really doing their best to make this world a better place to be in.
So would you say you're optimistic?
Yes, I can't afford not to be optimistic.
Well, bravo.
I cannot afford to be cynical, pessimistic. No.
Well, I'm very cautious. I say it sometimes, it's almost an African-American gesture of, and I'd say you're my brother. But hearing what you just said, there is something, a sense of kinship that I feel with you that I don't necessarily feel with all the wonderful artists that come through New York Live Arts. So I thank you very much for the richness of your experience, how articulate you are and courageous. And the work is, I look forward to seeing the work up front because I want to know, I want to smell that coffee. Yes.
I get you.
Okay, Faustin, thank you very much. And we really look forward to welcoming My Body, My Archive into New York Live Arts in the not too distant future. And Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you too. And thank you for this wonderful moment, really. Very rich. It's such an honor.